Everyday Samurai, Episode 30. Greetings, friends, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, in service to your liberty and the security of a free state. How are you? Thank you for joining us, and thank you for being here. I certainly appreciate you sharing the show with a friend or someone you think that would resonate with the message of advancing liberty by way of the martial arts. And that's what we're here for. You know, when we look at the world today, it seems like things are topsy-turvy and quite haywire. And that's why adhering to principle is so much more important than trying to follow data or continually searching for new advice. It's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric, and the confusing messages out there can leave someone quite bewildered in most cases. And as we know from Sun Tzu, who wrote 2,500 years ago in The Art of War, that all war is based on deception. And von Clausewitz wrote in his book, Vom Krieg, that war is politics by other means. So when we're looking at the political landscape, we have to recognize that when we take these two principles together, war is based on deception and war is politics by other means, then it should come as no surprise that all politics are based on deception. Ultimately, martial art is rooted in politics. Not only are politicians expected to organize governance and structures to protect those under their care, their constituents, but that the primary focus of even instituting a government, if we follow the Declaration of Independence and its principles, stating that governments are instituted among men to secure rights, to provide security for the constituent body. Therefore, ultimately, all government is about the application of martial art in practice. Following that enlightened tradition that created the Constitution, the first political document ever conceived in liberty, and based on the understanding that all human beings are created equally and therefore endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that government is there to secure those rights and nothing more. So, at its essence, government is the orchestration of martial art for the defense of the constituent body, their lives, liberty, and property. Then the question becomes, how do you organize government in such a way that the martial art can be practiced to secure what needs to be secured without allowing those in positions of power to abuse their offices? This has been the perennial question. All political analysis is about discerning what is right, what is good, what should be the policy, what should be enacted. Yet throughout history, all governments were formed through conquest. That's what makes the United States Declaration of Independence so unique. Yes, of course, it follows in the tradition of several hundred years worth of a slow march towards liberty as being the primary political value. However, the Constitution that followed from the Declaration of Independence was the first time that a political document, a political charter, a contract between free and independent states was made in the furtherance of and specifically for liberty, recognizing not only the independence of states, but also that the people were the sovereign. And when it comes to people, particularly martial artists, focusing simply on individual rights and individual respect for property and securing what's important to them, of course, has its place. But again, martial art is rooted in politics. The political structure that allows people to protect themselves, that allows people to have the means to protect themselves, is what makes it effective, because no man is an island. No individual can survive long on their own. In fact, what makes for an ever-increasing living standard is the division of labor, the cooperation between people in a society, and indeed between societies. The more we expand the division of labor, the more we expand social cooperation, the more ability we have to elevate our material standards of living. And that's ultimately what every political economic system strives towards. Even the Marxists admit that production is to elevate the human condition so that they can focus on more spiritual or cultural aspects of life. And of course, nowadays, the Marxists even acknowledge that that particular system of social organization, the communal ownership of the means of production, does not generate the material well-being that it first promised. Therefore, the Marxists had to take their critical theory and focus on other things, such as culture and victimhood and other ideas of tearing down traditional structures, such as the family, such as the so-called patriarchy, and all the other aspects of life that are under attack these days. But I want to take this back to a more personal level before we expand it out into the wider ramifications, because everybody has an idea of why they started training in martial arts, or perhaps you don't, and now would be a good time to ask that question. What is your interest in martial arts? When did you first become interested in training in martial arts? And for me, I can go back to a number of different reasons. Perhaps growing up in a violent household that ultimately led to a divorce left me with a sense of lacking security. Therefore, seeing martial arts movies or reading books and magazines showed me that there was a path that I could protect myself and the perceived threats that I was dealing with at home. And then, of course, coming of age in school and the other socialization processes, interacting with other people, of course, conflicts arise. But I think more it started at home for me. So naturally, growing up in the 80s as I did, First Blood and Commando and all these other slew of war-related movies that were popping up in the early 80s drove me towards studying and admiring the soldier, the martial artist, the one who can stand strong and defend against attacks. And it always seemed intuitive to me that people should always be armed, that at the very best, any protection that government could provide would only be supplemental to what the individual can do for themselves. When you look at it in the sequence of time and in reality, how events unfold, this has to be true. It can be no other way. When you're in a situation where you need help, even the best help, even the most efficient help, even the most responsive help has to show up after the incident occurs. Therefore, each individual has to be proactive in securing themselves and their interests and their property. Always be on the lookout, always having situational awareness. These are the things that lead to prevention. But once an incident is unfolding, once you're under attack, you have to have skills, tools, and a plan to ward off that incident, or at least hold the situation until help can arrive. So I really don't know when I started to adopt this attitude, but it always seemed intuitive that people should always be armed. And indeed, looking now, once informed by the lessons of political economy and the study of history, the founding fathers of the United States also held that the great object is that every man be armed, as Patrick Henry said. So for me, going to the flea markets on Sunday afternoons after church and buying knives and other implements of destruction and martial arts tools seems natural. And similarly, I always had a fondness for being outdoors. I remember one particular incident that left me with a strong impression that also leads to understanding the sequence of events in politics. Perhaps you can relate to this, because boys will be boys and cruelties will be visited upon each other at times, and that's natural. It's a part of growing up. However, this one particular incident informed me a lot about how people will try to do things in a surreptitious way to try and convince you that they have your best interests at heart, but ultimately they will do cruelties. And this one particular incident is when I went fishing with my older cousin. And of course, having a knife at my side and being more interested in running around in the woods or practicing my martial skills than fishing, I was watching at the edge of the water bank as a fish was kind of hovering in the shallows, and very proud of the fact that I had this knife that I bought at the flea market that was one of the styled after Rambo and had a compass in the handle, etc. I was able to throw that knife and stick the fish, and it had been the first time that I ever accomplished something like that, so I was pretty proud of it and I was quite jubilant. I found that more effective than trying to cast a line and catch them with a hook. So I was quite excited that I had accomplished this and had my knife back in my hand and picked up the fish. And my cousin saw that I was so happy, and he was several years older than me, and he came up and was congratulating me. He was like, "That's pretty cool. Let me see your knife." And then he took the knife from my hand, and once he had that, he said, "Let me see your fish." And he took the fish and stuffed it down my shirt. And as I can recall, I picked up the next stick I could find and chased him around until I got tired. Boys will be boys, like I said. But the key lesson here is the sequencing, the incremental approach to encroachment. First, you have to disarm someone before you can visit cruelties upon them. When two antagonists face off against each other, they are looking for an opening. They're trying to find a weakness in the other person's defenses so that they can move in with as little opportunity to incur damage and the highest probability of success. This is especially true when weapons are involved, because weapons are the great equalizer. This is why aggressors will always look for an opportunity to disarm their opponent. This happens at the interpersonal level as well as the political level, the international level. And when you look at history, you can also recognize that this is the same sequence, that people will try to present themselves in a way that is to your benefit, and they will try to disarm you in ways described as helping you. And then they will be free to exert their will, or take what's yours, or to demean you. And this is the path of tyranny, and it's available to be witnessed as that sequence throughout history. Many times they might not even have ill designs at first. It might be something that comes to them spontaneously in the moment. They don't have to start out with the idea of visiting cruelties upon their fellow man. They can just naturally find themselves in that position where they can exert themselves and they can gratify themselves at other people's expense. This is why the principle of always being armed has to be inculcated in a free society and not give an inch. When you give up 1% of the principle, you've opened the door to every imaginable downward slide. This is why in the U.S. Constitution, it's not only clear that the people have a right to always be armed, but it is indeed necessary to the security of a free state that those same people be organized, armed, and trained to carry out the laws of the Union. So any calls for disarming the people writ large without due process specifically to the individual is a non-starter, and not one single inch can be given in that regard. When we look at Japanese history, we can see a natural inclination toward ever-increasing centralization of control, ultimately leading to stagnation, impoverishment, and even worse, conflict. So there's no justification, no excuse for giving tyrants, and it doesn't matter if they start out as tyrants, of course they're going to try to present themselves as being benefactors, as being benevolent, as trying to help the people. But ultimately they always wind up as humanitarians with guillotines. When you look at the three great unifiers of Japan, starting with Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and then ultimately with the Tokugawa shogunate, the roots of weapons control that led to that monopoly on the use of force, and then ultimately the decline of the samurai and the stagnation of the nation, it starts with Hideyoshi's sword hunt, when he had finally won enough battles and had enough tacit control. He started implementing restrictions, locking in the class system. None of that happened prior to a near monopoly on the use of force. This is why the monopoly on the use of force is the root of all evil when it comes to destructive political economy. Even at that level, when Hideyoshi was near enough to solidifying his power, he called for that sword hunt. If you were a farmer, you could not rise to the rank of samurai, even though he had done that himself, kind of like pulling up the ladder once somebody had achieved success. He's the one that put in the rigid hierarchies and that class structure and closed off social mobility to so many people. This is another reason why government licensing schemes are so destructive to freedom, and ultimately leading to not only impoverishment for people, because you have to first buy a piece of paper or permission before you can actually start engaging in business, but also it's about control. It's about solidifying that centralization of control, and then having to ask, Mother, may I? Looking for permission before you can do what is naturally your right to do, and let the free market decide whether or not you can actually satisfy customers. So locking in that class structure, solidifying hierarchies, making agreement with guilds, and granting government monopolies in every field of service. That is how social mobility becomes stagnated. Social mobility becomes denied. So even going back to Toyotomi Hideyoshi's day, he locked in the class structures, he locked in alliances with certain guilds even, so that certain industries were the exclusive control of politically aligned networks. This closed off the field of endeavor to other aspiring competitors. thereby, as we know from the lessons of political economy, raising the price and probably lowering the quality. And the same is true in the production of security and justice. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi went on his famous sword hunt, he was taking swords and weapons and the means of self-defense away from the farmers and the artisans and the craftsmen and the other members of society that did not currently hold samurai rank. Of course, he did it under the name of securing the peace, and he took those swords and melted them down and forged a great Buddha so that he could say he was in service to the higher spiritual aspects of the nation. But what he really did was deny people the means of self-defense, forcing them to pay taxes to him, thereby eating out their substance, as we would get from the Declaration of Independence. And then what did he do? Once he had that monopoly on the use of force, or the near monopoly on the use of force, close enough to be called the monopolist, he took the financial and energetic resources of the nation on a foreign adventure, invaded Korea. So this is another familiar pattern that we can take notice of, not only in Japan, but everywhere, that once a near monopoly on the use of force settles a territory, those leaders tend to take the resources and the energies and direct them outward. One might call this the cycle of the state, as Dan Sanchez did, taking that idea of the ratchet effect from Robert Higgs and then the paradox of imperialism from Hans Hermann Hoppe in this discernible pattern of incrementalism, that nations, governments will increase their powers because of a supposed crisis and ratchet up. And even after the crisis unfolds and is resolved, some of those powers might be ratcheted down. However, they never reach that original level. This is kind of like Anthony DeJasse's idea of political churn. The churning is always towards centralization, greater control of resources for the politicians and the bureaucrats at the expense of everyone else. And the paradox of imperialism is that the more financial resources that a state has, the more access to wealth that a state has, the more resources that they have to go abroad in search of monsters to slay. And since every nation state is a monopolist on the use of force in decision making, they have an incentive, and I know we've talked about this in previous episodes as well. It's called the ruler's dilemma. They need to constantly increase their access to resources because in order to maintain their centralized position, they have to make certain people better off. But in order to do that, they have to make some people worse off. This drive for resources means they always have to be expanding their reach, their power, their influence, their ability to take from others. Because the expansionist state is encroaching upon territory claimed by another, they will naturally come into conflict with every other nation state, driving towards centralization even on the international scene. This is what Professor John Mearsheimer calls the tragedy of great power politics. It's an uncertain world out there. The international market for security is anarchic. There is no centralized authority, at least not yet, and not without a lot of trying in the past with a number of different institutions that have ultimately failed. Professor Mark Mazauer's book, Governing the World, talks about this in detail. So nation-states are in constant competition with one another, and they cannot be certain about the intentions of those neighbors. Therefore, they have to be on the offense. And these offensive strategies might have a variety of different flavors. They could directly compete, which might lead to a violent conflict, or they can hedge, they can form alliances, they can try to manage relationships depending upon their relative power. All of this stems from the whole nature of believing that a monopoly on the use of force and decision-making in a given geographic territory is a good thing, that there should be only one source of law, that there should be ultimate authority over people and their property, rather than people choosing what they can do with their property and finding voluntary arrangements, including the arrangement for security, which the United States Constitution wanted to do, took great strides towards advancing, yet ultimately still maintained that erroneous belief that nation-states were monopolists over the people that they governed. That too was the central flaw in what was going on in Japan during the Sengoku Jidai period of warring states. Each of the daimyo, or the great leaders of clans and houses and territories, were fighting amongst each other so that they can become that premier military leader governing in the name of that central authority called the emperor. They too had the erroneous belief that law should come from one source. And going back all the way to 939 in Masakado's rebellion, Taira no Masakado said this ultimately is corrupt, that relying on one source for law and decision-making has been a waste of time for me. He got screwed over on a land deal. He had been to court 3 times thinking that he had settled the matter. And then when some bureaucrats changed hands and they were willing to accept bribes from Masakado's competitive relatives, the rulings in his favor had changed. So he threw up his hands and said, this is ridiculous. I don't need to be a part of this. I'm going to be my own emperor. I'm going to have my own law in the Kanto plain. Ultimately, he lost his head, but the idea is that having a central authority leads to corruption, leads to perverse outcomes, and indeed actually increases the likelihood of conflict, the incidence of conflict, which is what having a central authority is supposed to prevent, according to Thomas Hobbes and his book Leviathan. In fact, the opposite is true. We can understand this now using the science of political economy to understand these insights and then see it play out in history, in our experience. And that's certainly true in Japan. And we can see these perverse outcomes playing over and over in Japan, not only during the period of the samurai, but then after the Meiji Restoration, and Japan became a more centralized state. Once they got their internal house in order, they started looking outward. They started looking towards the continent and securing East Asia, in the name, of course, protecting them from imperial powers from the West. But the result was always the same. It was about securing resources and controlling people for their own benefit. And the 20th century is, of course, an example of how centralized states going to war creates massive dislocations, massive disruptions, massive impoverishment. And again, this all stems from the erroneous belief that there should be one source of authority over man, over humans, over society, when in fact, the greatest example of peace and progress comes from Law and Revolution, a tremendous book by Harold Berman that I highly recommend. It details the competing systems of law available in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, where all these ideas of human freedom and liberty come from. Having alternatives and recognizing that law is very simple. It's the opinions of interpreting specific cases that becomes complex. Law is very simple, and we can distill it down to 2 simple phrases. Do all you have agreed to do, and do not encroach upon other people or their property. And from this we have the basis of all contract law and criminal torts. So the question is then only about, was there an agreement made, or was a property violated? Because the human body is a property, as John Locke indicated. Every person has a property interest in themselves, in their own person. And then, as the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States indicates, people have a right to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. So we come back to the United States Constitution being a political charter in pursuit of natural law, in pursuit of the highest ideas of reason, and the simple premise that equal justice under the law is available. It's the implementation of that law that becomes complex. And when you can only appeal to one central authority to interpret that law, of course there's going to be corruption. We can see that now. The idea of the Constitution being the mechanism that binds down corruption has turned out to be a farce. There's no such thing as the rule of law and not of man, because it is human beings, fallible human beings, that are executing the law by holding these public offices. And that's just not how the Constitution was designed. The people acting as the final executive of that law, by that I mean the people themselves, self-governance, executing the law, is the ultimate check on corruption, on abuses of power. And it's enshrined in the United States Constitution that the people themselves need to be organized, armed, and trained to execute the laws, to repel invasions, and to suppress insurrections. Civic duty requires that people become adept at the martial arts, not only for their own self-defense, but for the defense of their community, the defense of each other. And community can be defined in so many different ways. And again, that diversity of community and the voluntary association to build community, communities that are organic, based on mutual concern for one another because people share common characteristics. They have a shared culture. That's real community, not the forced integration that we have now. Anyone who doubts this should think about the gerrymandering of congressional districts that artificially put people into the same voting block. It seems to be quite absurd when you actually see it drawn out on a map. And this creates that artificial tension between groups that don't belong in the same bucket. It's only the fact that government districting puts them in the same bucket that creates that tension, and that serves the political class. Politicians and bureaucrats can live high on the hog while the people are fighting each other, knowing that one election can alter the fate of their financial well-being and so many other aspects of life. And whether they intend to be villains or not, once they're in that position of power, they can see the opportunity. They can see the pathway forward for enriching themselves. No matter how well-intentioned a politician may be when they enter office, once they get inculcated by the system, they realize just how business gets done. And they also see that if they're going to survive, they're going to have to generate lots of money to hold their position, to make other people better off, and satisfy the ruler's dilemma. And also in that path, they find that they can enrich themselves and enjoy the benefits of all the power and decision-making authority and the ability to attract to themselves the benefits of holding public office. Trust me, I've been in government my entire adult life. Even the best-intentioned people get corrupted by the system. They get corrupted by the benefits. And they do it all at the expense of the taxpayer. And that's another reason why holding to the principle is more important than getting involved in political debates about who said what when. It's more about seeing what their real intentions are and taking notice of any designs that they might have to encroach upon people or their property. Because upholding the common law, guarding against encroachments, and ensuring that contracts are fulfilled leaves very little discretion for politicians and bureaucrats. And so they would not have very much discretionary authority to exert upon what is held by another. They don't like this. So of course they have to undermine the common law, make it more complex. But that's not what the constitutional order was designed to do. And the corruption doesn't happen all at once. It happens incrementally, like we've talked about. It happens in stages, just like boiling the proverbial frog. You can't throw a frog into a hot boiling pot of water. You have to let the frog into a nice room temperature pot of water and then slowly turn up the heat. This is another example of why there can be no compromise, not even of a single degree, on any of the principles that are essential to human dignity and liberty. And this is a liberating way to look at the situations that we see in the news on a daily basis. We're no longer buffeted about by whim and political machinations, not tethered to parties and different talking points that might come out to justify encroachment. Because ultimately, when you examine any proposed policy, the question has to be, who's going to pay for this and for what? Is it ultimately in alignment with? Is it flowing from an authority derived from the original contract? And if it's not, then it needs to be rejected out of hand, dismissed immediately, and resisted if ever brought into legislation. This is why we train. This is why not only training in the martial arts, but also understanding political economy is so important to the security of a free state. And when I say free state, we're referring to something that is contrary to the idea of a monopoly state. A free state is where people are secure in their persons, papers, houses, and effects. A free state is where people get to choose who they will interact with, how they will interact with them, and any services that they purchase are done voluntarily. Those that try to use force or violate their agreements or disrespect the property of others are sharply rebuffed. Maintaining such a society and government services that adhere to the natural law and the original contract is very inexpensive to maintain. Abiding by the principles are very simple, and everything else is left to the free market. Therefore, financial resources are available for the betterment of society. Specialists will emerge to cater to every need, and in such an environment, society can flourish. Charities can flourish. Cultural undertakings can flourish. Scientific research can flourish. New ways of designing conveniences, labor-saving technologies can flourish. And in that space, where material needs are easily satisfied, more spiritual pursuits are available. More time is available. More creativity and innovation flow when people are satisfied, when people are comfortable, when they have achieved their lower end hierarchy of needs, as Abraham Maslow outlined. Yet, of course, the world that we occupy looks very, very different from the natural outcome of common law, and the free state promised by the U.S. Constitution. What was intended to be the smallest government ever conceived has turned out to be the most expensive, the most invasive ever known in the history of humanity. It is one based on encroachment, one that invades every aspect of life, not the least of which is the economic sphere and the lifeblood of economic activity, which is the monetary supply. The Constitution's very clear. Congress can coin money, and no state can make anything but gold and silver legal tender for the payment of any debts. Yet we do not have that. We were not supposed to have a standing army, yet we have that. And we have a whole host of offices that do nothing but eat out the substance that the people need to survive. Again, none of this was part of the original design. And these deviations from original principle and the order of contract for services is why there is so much contention, so much conflict, and so much civil strife within society today, because people are paying more than they've ever had to pay before for governmental services, and because governmental services are encroaching upon ever-increasing swaths of life. Control of those offices becomes crucial to survival, even though people have conflicting visions of what they want their lives to look like. You might be asking yourself, what does this have to do with martial arts? And I would respond, everything. Because every martial artist needs to understand the drivers of conflict. That is the nature of martial art, is how to overcome conflict, how to be victorious in the face of conflict. And we have learned that the best way to prevail in conflict is to avoid it altogether. We're looking for harmonious situations that are not destructive. One must take it whole when contending for all under heaven, as Sun Tzu rightly pointed out. So every martial artist cannot but consider these things. It is the ground of extinction or survival. I would also take that one step further, because life is meant to be lived abundantly, not just on a survival basis. We want to flourish. We want to see others flourish. We want to have happiness and peace and harmony and ever-increasing living standards. That's what life is meant to be. That's the promise of liberty. And the good news is that liberty and prosperity walk hand in hand, whereas encroachment and impoverishment walk hand in hand. Therefore, adhering to principle is the best way to provide for not only the security of a free state, less conflict, more harmony, but also more prosperity, more abundant living. And that is the promise of society. From Aristotle all the way down through our present age, great philosophers have described that people enter into society to enjoy the good life. That includes health, harmony, happiness, wholeness, and self-expression. That's what a civic-minded martial artist does. They train for their own benefit, their own self-development, but also being able to make a positive contribution to the community at large. This is the best that we can do to be a force for good in the world and be in service not only to a free state, but to humanity and a world that truly does work for everyone. And one of the best things that you can do to raise your capacities and bring your best self forward is to be grounded in a mindfulness practice. A mindfulness practice is the essential component that allows you, that empowers you, that gives you the tools you need to see clearly. And one of the best tools out there to empower your mindfulness practice is the meditation technology found in Brain Shots. Brain Shots use binaural beat technology to move your mind into the ideal state of receptivity so that you can create the outcomes you want, whether it be relaxation, confidence, motivation, physical healing, or to bring forth your genius capacities. Brain Shots are a quick and effective way to incorporate a mindfulness practice into your daily life, into your daily routine. So I suggest you go to everydaysamurai.life/brain shots today and get a free download of one sample, a full 15 or 30-minute meditation that you can use to see the power of this impressive technology operating in your life at no cost to you. So go to everydaysamurai.life/brain shots today. Friends, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai and look forward to seeing you next time. If you like what you've heard here, please give us a thumbs up or a 5-star review on the podcatcher of your choice. Remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. You can also get updates from our email list by signing up when you go to everydaysamurai.life. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.